Welcome to Smarter Cities with me, Jason D'Souza. My guest today has made a career from being an agent provocateur, pushing bureaucracies and governments to conceptualise, procure and deliver better cities. Tim Williams developed his passion for cities in his native UK. He was a founding member of the Blair government's Prime Minister's Delivery Unit, which drove significant policy reforms to British government services and served as a special advisor on urban development, city strategy and housing to successive UK ministers. From there, he advised both national and regional authorities on the development and regeneration of East London, ensuring the UK achieved a lasting dividend from its investment in the 2012 London Olympics. Since arriving in Australia in 2010, Tim has continued his advocacy for better cities across senior public-facing roles, including the very important Committee for Sydney, and serves as a city advocate for Grimshaw, amongst many other roles. As Australian cities face rising populations, continued infrastructure development needs, and an aspiration for our nation to step up as a senior middle power economy in the world, how should we move forward in meeting these challenges? Well, Tim Williams joins me now to debate this question. Welcome to Smarter Cities.
Hello, Jason. Thank you for inviting me. That person sounds really interesting.
He did. Well, a good friend of ours once described you as Australia's most famous Welsh intellectual.
Well,
and I think that's a good description.
Although I did find one that I regarded as more intellectual and more Welsh than me recently, so I am a bit worried that my crown has fallen. Although it's a very limited gene pool of talent. It has to be said. You know what I mean? But thank you for referring to the fact that I'm obviously working in New South Wales, but I'm from Old South Wales originally, and I regard that as I was assigned Welsh at birth.
It's so far, I actually hadn't even made that link.
People don't. It shows how unimportant Old South Wales is in their thinking, that they think, oh wow, but that's where I'm from.
I always joke that I'm a child of the colonies, right? I was in the last duel in Hong Kong and left just before the handover. Right?
I regard you as a near-perfect product of late British imperialism.
Well, there you go. That's exactly correct. That's exactly correct. Well, look, it's wonderful to have you on. Thank you for coming on. Look, you've had a really interesting and varied career, so I want to get into a bit of that. Yeah. And obviously here we're passionate about cities, so who better than to talk to than a cities expert? Before we get into it, though, I want to just drill in a bit more than our introduction into how you got into the space you're in, right? Yeah. So, you were obviously in the UK, you had a number of senior roles in Prime Minister Blair's government. I have some empathy with that. I had a career here in government as well in a senior level. It's a wonderful place.
I loved it, yeah. And I'm still fascinated by it. So much so that the trouble is, whenever I'm not putting words in your mouth, but whenever I see a politician or an advisor on television, instead of entirely listening to what they're saying, I think to myself, what do they mean by that? And what are they getting at here? What's the real game?
What's the actual point?
What's the actual point? And so I'm a bit difficult to please, I think, on these matters. But how I got into all this, and I really want people to get this, because the great thing about the kind of cities discussion is that you can come at it from all sorts of angles. I'm basically a generalist historian who fell into running a thing in East London back in '98, which had 12 local councils in it, a bit like where there are Australian versions of these groupings of councils.
What we're trying to do around the airport.
Yeah, exactly that. And it was at the time that the Blair government come in. They didn't have an agenda; they just won an election, really. So it was kind of a great time to put some new ideas about how we should grow London to the Blair government. So we did that outside government. And then I just got attracted into government because we were really successful. And I came away with lots of lessons. But basically, accidentally, I saw an advert in a newspaper and I thought, that's about 5 kilometers from my house, I can cycle there. So essentially, I didn't know I was going to end up doing this kind of stuff. So we boiled the ocean in East London, and I came away with thinking, that's really good. Local authorities from below can group together to shape upwards. So I got this idea early on that I didn't know how big I was, as it were, because we'd had great success working together, managing upwards. And we got things like the Channel Tunnel railing to go through Stratford. It was never meant to go through Stratford. Yep. And without that, no Stratford, no Olympics.
And look at Stratford
Look
now.
at Stratford, it's totally transformed.
A completely sort of underutilised part of London.
It was a real mess. Yeah. And now and again, you get people who knock these things, legacies, Olympics and stuff, but I tell you, if you ask the people of East London, and particularly in that area, they would just say it's an amazing transformation. It's 4,000 jobs that were never there before, all kinds of jobs. Universities are there. There's an amazing park. There's beautiful development, partly built by Lend-Lease, which is there.
Yeah.
Well, and I worked
International
for them,
Quarter
at the time. So no, I mean, and again, I came away realizing transport changes the world. That transport and placemaking go together. And I could see it, we did it. And so on the back of that, I get to 2005 and I'm asked to become special advisor to the rising star at that time, who was David Miliband.
Oh, right.
Yeah, who was meant to take over from Blair until his brother scuppered him.
Ed.
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 Yes, right.
Which I always thought a prime ministerial candidate would really not want to go with Ed.
No,
right? But I mean,
I think that was the least of his problems. But essentially, your younger brother comes through and beats you.
Yeah.
Right. So and of course, then Cameron wins an election, and the history of the country is different. Miliband was meant to win, and so I worked for them, and I found out what you could do on the interface between the public sector and the private sector. City making is not just for one sector; it's for all of them kind of coming together. So and then I came to Australia because my wife is Australian, as you know.
Ah, yes.
And so
it's the same problem. See, I married an Australian.
Well, you see,
once you do that,
it's a lost cause. I mean, she thinks I stalked her for the passport, and so because and there's nothing in that, by the way. Just to be clear about that.
Sorry.
But the last part about all this was that when I came, I didn't have a great plan. I didn't have a job to come to. I mean, that is now I think at the age of 54, I migrated without a job, right? So, but I was profoundly lucky, and I'll stop at this point, is that because this brings us up reasonably to date, is that I was going to become head of cities for Arup in Australia, and then I got a phone call effectively from Lucy Turnbull, who I'd never heard of, who was vice chair.
To become the committee for Sydney.
She was the deputy chair of the committee for Sydney, and said, we'd heard what you were doing in East London, do you think you can do the same for Sydney? And I thought, I think I'll have a go at that.
And the committee for Sydney, and the committee for Melbourne, and the committee for Adelaide, such important organisations.
Timing is important, though, don't you think?
You just need a voice outside of government of people who are not developers and not infrastructure
I think
providers,
that's really
and
important.
not profit driven.
The model is important, right?
Yeah.
We were advocates for the city, not for the causes of each of our companies. Yeah. So we didn't touch planning stuff. We touched strategic planning stuff, right? So I just to say a little bit about that, these organisations, cities collaborate to compete, right? That's the secret sauce. It's one of the reasons why I'm quite, by the way, just an aside, I'm quite optimistic about a place like Newcastle, because I think...
Yeah, I'm very proud.
Because it's got a great location and bones and stuff, but it's also working together to try and attract the investment. So the Committee for City model, which is like the London First model, the Committee for Melbourne model, is that we discuss strategic issues of common benefit, but put the private sector voice at the table. It's not about looking after number one, it's about sharing the problems and answers for the city.
And I think in an era when governance is becoming more and more complicated and more difficult and more soundbite driven, being respectful, having just been in Canberra and watching some of the debate, you need organisations like this to have the debate.
I think it's right. I think what is interesting, Jason, and you were part of it. You were active members in Lend-Lease from early days, early adopters. Is I think you got, and we kind of were aiming for, that there was a sense I think we had, I think I might have had this, that there was a progressive shift in thinking amongst companies internationally, right? So internationally, agendas were shifting, where reporting on various things like, for example, ESG today, but let us just say reporting on the social impact that companies were going to have, and the fact that they were thinking about outside the curtilage of their building a lot more. Lend-Lease historically, to be fair to them, have always had a strong...
This has always been our ethos.
And it's no BS, as we say technically. I think Lend-Lease historically has had a very unusual insertion in Australian culture around these things. Yeah. So we were trying to attract in the Committee for Sydney a non-transactional approach to private sector involvement in the city. And so they become citizens and advocates for the rest of us, right? And if you've got, a company thinking like that and being progressive on these issues, boy, do they have energy and resources to help, right? So that's what happened. We brought people together, and we also, this, I was very keen also to make sure there was a meeting point for the clever bits of the public sector, the ones who had a real ambition to change the world, so they could meet like-minded people across sector without worrying about procurement.
Yeah, and you certainly did that. I mean, Tim, I'm just going to get you to face the camera a little bit more, because otherwise the audience doesn't get the benefit of you.
Well, it's funny. I do think I have a great face for radio.
So do I. Don't
I'm not
worry.
entirely sure about this, but anyway. Thank you for interrupting me in a correct way. I think that was the line, right?
Yeah.
And so again, I kind of learned. But you got to understand the great thing. I just came off the boat, right? So I didn't know anybody.
Yeah.
So I think this amazing thing about timing as well, right? So there was the right time. We'd had a pretty shoddy, end of the last regime in 2010, 2011. New Liberal government coming in,
Which had a large infrastructure agenda. And that's when I joined the government.
Spirit, and just kind of younger leadership. Baird was kind of, the Kennedy of our era. This kind of stuff. I'm kidding, but you know what I mean. It was that kind of feel. So
there was that feel,
and it was just like a kind of opening up.
Yeah.
So I think it's always important when you try something like an initiative like Committee for City. Timing is everything.
And Lucy was an outstanding
chair,
right?
and she knew, she knew lots of people. But I mean, think of the autobiographical thing for me. I didn't know anybody, and now I know lots and lots of people through that experience, right? And so, and within a very short period of time, absurdly, I was then advising, the national government on cities policy, because you may recall the Turnbulls were quite important at that point.
And so now Prime Minister Albanese
indeed
had established a cities unit. So
he's a big cities guy.
Very, very passionate about it. I remember, my then boss, Duncan Gay, who after I worked with the Premier and the Prime Minister, now Prime Minister, are pretty close. They did lots of work together. Yeah. One of the things that they were both passionate about is, which we share a passion about, is how transport infrastructure actually creates cities. So I want to get to that in a second, but before we do, one of the things you did in your UK experience was Michael Barber and you were involved in the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit, which we actually adopted in New South Wales. So we had Michael come out, and I've read his book.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful book. And what's interesting about it is it actually set some targets for what policy should deliver, which is sort of a bit of an anathema to many people.
What an amazing idea.
What an amazing idea. How did it work? How did it work in a new Blair administration to set targets for education standards, for healthcare, for children's obesity levels? I mean, it's quite a technical
and
thing.
Actually was the reason, one of the reasons why the second Blair government was much more successful than the first Blair government. And it's a warning from history to all politicians, by the way. So the Blair government entered as a campaigning, oppositional force and stayed that way for 3 to 4 years and didn't get on top of government and then decided to be fair,
in its second
and then
term,
said they had to sort out delivery, right?
Yeah.
So they brought in somebody who did know about delivery. This is a mate of mine, and just to put it in context, Gore Vidal once said memorably that a little bit of him dies when he contemplates the success of his friends, right? So this is my response to Sir Michael Barber.
That's true.
I'm lowly, Republican Tim Williams at this point, but he's Sir Michael Barber. Anyway, but he was ex-councillor background, so he knew how local government worked. We'd worked together in the National Union of Teachers. He had a very strong sense of performance and how to measure it, right? This is the key. And I think, by the way, there is an autobiographical link here because, of course, I helped socialise Michael in the New South Wales government context.
You brought him in.
So I helped bring him in, right? Okay. So, and that was really a very important moment.
Well, Mike Baird at the time and Babe Warburton, who was his chief of staff, really adopted this and brought that concept into New South Wales.
But the great thing about this city as a place to do stuff is I was sitting next to Bay at a Committee for City event, and he said, I've been reading this book by Michael Barber, and I said, well, I was the witness at his wedding.
Oh, right.
So it was that kind of thing, right? And the great thing about this city, in the best sense, I've always thought this was really interesting, is that you can get stuff up quickly. And I know some of the media say, people are too close to each other, and I understand all that, but some great stuff can happen because you can get quick decision making in this city in comparison with some of the systems I've worked in. I really believe
certainly in that early era. 2011 and sort of 2016.
Yeah, there was some pretty
big
stuff
reform,
done, right?
big infrastructure, leases involved.
So I think the important lesson for any government, and we're obviously in the middle of an election now, is that the machinery of government needs to be controlled, and you need to incentivize people, you need to inspire them, but you also need to guide them about the level of performance you expect, right? So all that the Barber deliverology is, here's what we want to do, here's the 3 years from now, what's the strategy to get there, and along the way, can we please measure how far and well we're getting there? And
which is what we do in a corporate setting, right?
Of course, but we don't do enough in government, right? And if we're not getting there, what interventions are we going to get in to put us up to trajectory.
I will add to that, because I think one of the things that Barber says in his book is political leadership and support for deliverology, which I think is what he calls it, and what you've called it, is critical. So without it, it dies, right? So unless you've got proper political sponsorship of initiatives, they die. And I think that's something we're losing a little bit in Australian polity generally, because I think, you know, the way some of the decisions are being made in a general sense now are lacking that political leadership. And we're asking for civil servants to try and drive policy reforms, and they can't do it without elected officials.
No, I completely agree. But by the way, we haven't talked about that, but I completely agree. And there's a kind of balance you have to strike. Data-driven policy, great, I love all that. But at the end of the day, the direction of travel has to be set by politicians because they got elected. They are the legitimate ones.
That's the point of democracy.
But they need to stand back a bit on the delivery side of it, because they essentially have given the job to other people to come up with the evidence base for what we're going to do. But the direction of travel is set by the politicians, and I get that. Some people are surprised to hear me say this because they think that there's some magical, objective way in which bureaucrats can run policy, and the answer is no. It's an elected matter. Policy is always determined by, in a sense, the electorate through the politicians. Correct. And the delivery of it is something that the more objective bureaucrats can help us with.
And I worry sometimes that there's too much focus group, too much community consultation, too much all this stuff that is supposedly trying to protect people from having to take a position on things, right?
I also think that there's the alternative to ruled by politicians is ruled by experts, as it were. And
there's a danger.
I'm a bit mistrustful of that. By the way, as an aside, if anybody wants to know how government really works, follow the WhatsApp leak story in the UK, which is
I haven't seen.
Oh, it's about the thousands of WhatsApp messages released from the former health minister who's managing COVID, and it's a lesson in government, and it's essentially showing how, and you and I will not be surprised to realise that some of the decision making wasn't quite as scientific based as we might have assumed, on the ground that politicians still have to win constituencies and get elected. Anyway, look out for that one.
Now we're massively off the topic, so I'm going to take us back.
Did you expect any difference?
Not unusually when we have conversations.
Go on then.
So, cities, right? Yeah. I hesitate to call you an expert because you just said you don't trust experts, but you are. What makes a great city? What are the key ingredients to a great city? So let me frame this question a little bit, right? So we are in Sydney, Australia's global city, largest city, Melbourne, brilliant city, very different types of city, very different types of population. We have aspirations in this country to be one of the great middle powers in the world. Sydney is our financial centre. Other cities, Brisbane, certainly has a future, a strong future.
Yeah, for sure. And
Adelaide has a strong future. What do we need to do to get it right? What are the ingredients?
So I'm going to reverse into that from the end point, which is one of the great strengths of Australia, which I think you only discover by really coming here. The downside, in a sense, is wow, it's big. The upside is that means that there are 5 or 6 separate regional or state economies or capital cities going on. It avoids the British problem of over concentration in London, which is a real problem. And when London doesn't do well, as I've just discovered in some research, the country doesn't do well, where it's not quite the same in Australia, right? Where you can actually have different cities powering at different time and all this kind of stuff. It affects all sorts of things in my view, in a positive way. So that's good. I think there's a temptation when we discuss cities to miss something that a lot of people just think, oh, really? Cities exist and were founded for economic and trade purposes, right? I.e., we love what they can do. They've got great culture. They bring people together. They do all sorts of things, but they originally exist for economic purposes. And even great, beautiful design cities that have lost their economic purpose strike me as dispirited, right? So
they're missing something.
They're missing something. So I think you can't get away from, what's the economic driver that has attracted millions of people here in the first place. So I think for me, never go too far. It's partly because I am from a kind of an economist historian. I'm very interested in the nuts and bolts of what drives things to happen, right? So demand, why do places work? I think the other thing is that you then got a discussion about design, you then have a discussion about planning, you then have a discussion about the kind of secret sauce in places, and and I think it's true. I mean, I hate the clumsiness of this, but the cities that we historically have loved, and we've got to work out what we do next, but of the ones where they've brought together lots of people in a kind of reasonably sufficiently dense to create, economic and cultural agglomeration and benefits and all that kind of stuff, but not so big that they feel inhuman and they feel impersonal and just too large. So during COVID, we saw people leave mega cities more than they left medium-sized cities, partly because of lots of other reasons. But let's just say you could probably get too big with the city thing, and on the other hand, you can't be big enough to have the university, to have the orchestra, to have all that kind of stuff. So there's a kind of pleasing scale. And I think the thing about Sydney and Melbourne is interesting. Very different structures, morphologies. It's fascinating case studies about the two of them. You can't generalize about these two.
They're very different.
They're
cities.
profoundly different.
Yeah.
They Melbourne at one level operates a bit more like a European shaped city, and it's a bit more walkable. And also at another level, it is still 100 kilometers wide. It is still essentially run on the car, so whereas Sydney's a bit more polycentric intrinsically, the rise of Parramatta is not an accident, it's and I do urge people, anybody by the way, my father-in-law hasn't been in Parramatta in 30 years and doesn't believe me that it's what it is today, right? So I think we kind of do know. I think the problem is once the car was invented and cities started shaping themselves around the car, we then entered a completely different era of lower density development further away from the sort of city amenity. And I think the task in Australia has been that we've created great residential suburbs. Can we now, in a sense, make sure that the next wave is about placemaking suburbs, suburbs that feel like town centres rather than just housing estates, I think, is where I'm at. So I think there's a big opportunity. The last point about this is growth. People might not realise this, but so Australia, even last year, it might not have imported anybody in 2020, 2021. 3 years. But 22, almost 200,000 people came in 22. So we're kind of back into that, 1.5% growth a year. Here's an analogy. Back in the 1920s, this is interesting, I think. Back in the 1920s, when the Spanish flu was around back in 1918, 1919, we saw an urban response to that, which is people in Chicago, New York left for California and Florida. People who could left because they were fleeing denser inner cities that were not so good climates and they thought were breeders of ill health to go to sunnier climes, right? Where the Californian bungalow was invented and imported, as you know, to Australia. I think we're about to see the same again, that Australia internationally will be pinpointed as a successful post-COVID environment in which to live. It's almost the only positive story about the climate we ever hear is that actually this is quite a good one from a health point of view in Australia. So I think we will see continued growth. The question becomes where and in what kind of cities people will live. We've been building very, very extended cities, and I'm just wondering where the model now goes.
So it's fascinating, right? And I think there's 2 points. So first, I would say we are absolutely one of the standout nations that people want to move to.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
So having just been home in Hong Kong and talking to so many of my old friends there, all of whom love living in Hong Kong, they all recognize the lifestyle standard here is just beyond anything that's used. And that is in a city where you can get anywhere in half an hour on any form of mass transit. They've just announced a new 10-station line out to Islands. It's forever.
But people still want to leave at some point.
Still want to leave. Leave meaning they don't want to leave because the economics are very strong, but they see the lifestyle opportunity here as something important. And I think you're right. I think we'll see migrants come here. Yeah. I would also say, though, the economic opportunity in Australia is strong and has been strong for a long time. Again, decades unbroken economic growth,
can we
no
talk
recession.
About that?
Yeah, we can. Yeah. I will say, though, that the job opportunities here far exceed anything that perhaps has been happening in Europe or even the United States.
So I think there are two. I'm going to darken the horizon slightly at this point, right? Because I
never saw you as the counterpoint to my optimism.
I was it's more that I like. I might have all sorts of I'm a sentimental Welshman with a tough-minded brain, right? So essentially, said he. But I think this is true. So here goes. There are two clouds on the horizon which I think need to be really thought through. I think one is we've this is my phraseology, but we've been for the last 40 years after the decline of the city model in which there was like industry close to the centre. We historically our ports. We then created an economy which is based on knowledge work and retail in the city centre, right? Knowledge workers were coming closer. So we built a city for knowledge workers, and then during COVID, the knowledge workers said, thank you very much, we don't need it anymore. we can do decentralized hybrid working. I'm just saying to you that I think that has an unresolved matter in my mind. And just to give you a flavour of what needs to be thought through is, as you know this, that the square kilometre of the city of Sydney in the CBD creates 7% of national wealth through professional and banking services.
Correct.
Right? I'm not convinced that people who are talking enthusiastically, and I understand it may not be reversible, about hybrid working are really understanding what that agglomeration of that city centre created for the nation, 7% of national GDP. Where's that going to come from in a more decentralised?
It's not going to come from your bedroom.
It's not going to come from your bedroom, however
or
good
your
your bedroom
cafe.
is, right? So it doesn't quite work for me, and I don't think politicians, the media, are really focusing enough on the economic problem that faces. I think the second thing, though, is in a world in which, again, understandably, we're moving towards ESG reporting, in a very deep way where people are concerned, obviously, about climate, that we're also obviously going to have a downturn, and we know this, in some of the exports that we have also been helping our economy. So there are two pieces of the national economy which have been working benignly for overall wealth in Australia, where there are question marks over. So the lifestyle benefits on the one hand, but it takes me to my more positive point, right, which is we need to get our skates on about creating the next innovation, green technology economy.
Yeah.
That's where I go.
Absolutely. And we take the advantage that we have today of a strong economy that is still generating substantial productivity and profit, and we invest that in the next generation of exports for Australia.
Yeah.
And I think you're hearing that narrative out of the government at the moment around things like rare earth, around hydrogen. I think hydrogen has so much potential as a clean fuel that can basically drive the next generation of productivity.
But
if it works.
Well,
it will work because we're all making a bet on it, right?
But what it plays to is what we started with around the Committee for Sydney, which is, I think, is a high moment for public-private collaboration. And we hear interesting stuff coming out of the new federal government around, in the old days we would have called it industrial policy. But I do think, and then people get, don't want state intervention. But at the end of the day, all the clever economies in the world, we know, you know this, the Chinese economy, the Hong Kong economy, the Korean economy, they're all based on a bit more advanced partnering between public and private sector than we've been used to in Australia.
But the word you've just used is partnering.
No, I agree.
There's a very big difference between old school industrialist policy and state ownership and the word partnering. And I think that is the advantage that we have in Australia over many other countries. Governments are becoming far more sophisticated about these things. I'm going to get you to face the camera once again.
I'm so sorry. But I think that's an amazing moment of reflection where, I'm going to get fancy at this point. I'm going to get very fancy.
Please.
Well, no, I'm not.
This is what the audience expects from you.
I know, but it's interesting that the terrible word neoliberalism, which really means virtually nothing.
It means nothing.
But essentially, I think the argument that we need a cleverer government intervention to match the changed needs of the moment. So I think, for example, that government is more needed when it's very unclear what the economic future is.
Absolutely.
So I think it is a moment. It's not like for 30 years, but for 10 years, we need probably much more advanced partnering between the public and private sector, because the models are not as clear as they were, either of city growth or economic development, than they were 3 years ago, right?
So let's look at hydrogen as an example, or let's look at any clean tech, for example. We wouldn't have reached a 30% renewable energy target without government subsidy. No way. Right? Because at that time, solar and wind, and certainly solar, domestic solar panels and that sort of thing, that market wasn't there. So it needed some framework for that.
I think two things about this. One is, governments don't just crowd markets; they can create markets.
Yes.
Right? And they use it either through their interventions positively or through their regulatory.
Correct.
Now I want to do something about housing in this. So I think that we're about to see a wave of new entrants to housing from housing delivery from a different direction to normal. I'll go into it from new investors coming into the market who are interested in ESG outcomes for residential. I think it won't be the usual developer or usually investor market. I think going forward we'll see, in a sense, public-spirited investment sort of stuff where people are interested in social return. Going into housing a lot more, we've started to see it.
So I think we'll see AXA with St George.
Absolutely, and in the UK, Legal & General has become one of the biggest housing developers. So I think we're going to see, and I think a lot of that is about new entrants driven by the regulatory requirements changing the game, And some of the usual suspects, and I don't mean Lend-Lease in this context, I'll come back to that, so I think scale helps in this one, don't know enough about how to build a kind of green, environmentally sort of brilliant home actually yet. So we will see also some new partnering between people who are technology people, green people, universities working with the developer and investor sector. So I think we're in a period of the reinvention of different kinds of capital coming into urban and economic and city development from different unexpected sources. What do you think?
Let's spend a bit of time on that, right? So I think housing is, I think, probably the top of the agenda at the moment in Australia, other than energy policy.
Yeah.
The government has announced a very large $10 billion fund for investment in social affordable housing.
Yeah.
They've changed the framework around how the government will intervene. Lend-Lease actually has taken a very strong position on this.
I welcome that.
Dale Connor and Tom McKellar are two of our leaders here, have sort of been out there saying we should have standard mandate percentages for affordable housing.
Can we talk about that?
Yep, that's exactly what I want to talk about.
I think it's really important that Lend-Lease did that, because they have been market makers for decades, right? And I feel as though it's a return to their business, the good business as usual of what they were before. The DNA comes out, right? They've taken an advanced position. I really think it's important. It was not going to happen because the government, you know this, right? Governments were far more timid than Lend-Lease have just been, right? And it took a Lend-Lease, frankly, and some of the others supporting them to establish political confidence that this is not a crazy idea, right? So just to give you, because I used to, one of the great signs that I am actually, I've been really supportive of the kind of Lend-Lease DNA. I used to work for them, as you know, right? Is that there's a thing I never used to say publicly, but Lend-Lease have just proven to me that they are as good as their word, right? So in the UK, they do Lend-Lease and others, everybody, 40% social housing through,
and we're trying to import that same type of concept.
But until you made that move, I used to get annoyed. I used to say, Christ, they'll do 40% in London, but zero. And it wasn't you. It's because you weren't made to do it. Now, we need to understand this. This is where I often get misinterpreted. Some of the things I say.
I can't imagine.
It is. I think it's my fault that I get misinterpreted. Because I basically have never been attacking developers on this because I knew it was a regulatory problem, right?
Yes.
So, and I used to try and divorce these things by saying, look, the problem is that in London it works like this. It's residual land value, right? And for those who think that's the most boring subject you ever heard, it's the most exciting thing you're about to hear because it is essentially, it says to the developer, here's the regulatory requirements in London. They've known it for 30 years now. It hasn't changed very much. It means when I buy the land, I buy that land net of those obligations.
Knowing there's a mandate.
Knowing that there's going to be a cost.
Yep.
The landowner gets less. The developer still makes the same margin, but delivers socially beneficial outcomes, right? There's nothing wrong with this model, right? But it takes political, I think balls might be the word actually
balls
to do it.
Courage is
probably a better word. Sorry, to de-sex it for a moment. But I think Lend-Lease have just.
This is a family podcast.
Absolutely right, and testicular confidence. I think somebody said. But somebody had to break ranks, right, and show leadership. And to be fair, on the very day I was having to go at our friend Michael Sorbus, who runs the Property Council of Australia, just been appointed. I said, great appointment, get on with inclusionary zoning and all this sort of stuff. He'd already done it.
Yeah.
So I think
I think it was made at his or one.
I think he was involved in this. But Lend-Lease have shown leadership, right? So we now have to. But the second bit of the equation, to be fair, is still missing, and it's not a Lend-Lease issue, right? In the UK.
In fact, he is the man who made the announcement. This is Tom McKellar right
here. There you go. I was just complimenting Tim Williams. Right? I'm just complimenting Lend-Lease on its leadership.
I saw your
yeah. I was. It took. I have. Of course we are. But it took a Lend-Lease to lead the way, right?
Yeah,
so,
thank you.
And also because governments didn't really understand what they were doing on that subject, and you've explained how it can be done. So I think, well done.
So Tom here, I don't know if you can see him in the shot, but Tom is the one that went out there and led our position on affordable housing in this market, which Tim has been talking about.
And although my Australian wife is so modest, she hates this phrase that she taught me about, is it called pissing in other people's pockets, right? which I had never heard before, and I suddenly realized that I was probably doing on a daily basis just because I'm a very positive and welcoming human being, right? But I do think that Lend-Lease deserves huge credit. What I was going to say, the missing bit of the equation to come is we have to build up the resources of the social housing providers.
Absolutely correct.
Because that is the other side of the equation in the UK.
Well, look, Tom, as I said, Tom's been leading this here, and we're very passionate about it, and we intend on taking a very senior role in it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tom.
Impromptu.
You'll see yourself on the podcast
Where
soon.
were we?
Now, look, I just want to go back to this question of capital as well,
Yeah.
because I think there's 2 points that have been made. So it's fine to say we should have a target for affordable housing. As you know, we completely support it.
Yeah.
But and you made the point of residual land value. The point on affordable housing is that it is something that is subsidized by the development. And the only way that it can actually be paid for is with additional density to enable that to happen.
I agree. But that's an Australian problem.
Well, correct.
I'll
it's
explain,
an Australian
I'll
problem.
Explain it. I understand it.
Can you give us a bit of an insight into that? Because it works in the UK for that reason.
Yeah, so I think there are 2 ways of doing this. So one is you get your density bonus. I've never entirely understood the density bonus thing from a design point of view, because if it's meant to be 8 stories, it's meant to be 8 stories, right? But subsidized housing needs subsidy. Right? I don't want to get too technical with these matters.
It's got to come from somewhere.
It's got to come from somewhere. So I think in the Australian context, at the moment, it comes from the development, right? It comes back to the residual land value, right? Which is that it's only extra if you ask people to do these things after they bought the land, right? So I still think there is an issue about knowing that you're going to do your 8 stories and one of them is going to be social housing or whatever before you buy the land is still a very big advantage, not requiring as much subsidy to do. I literally believe that too much of what we ask developers to do happens after they bought the land when it's too late. So voluntary planning agreements don't really work for me. They're just too late in the process, right? So whatever we do, go early in the process. But the second thing is, in the UK, there is grant.
Yeah.
Right?
That's absolutely
correct.
There is
grant. And even though it's not as big as it was, there's still grant that fills the gap of affordability, if you like. So the social housing providers get grant to purchase units with a lend lease in the UK, right? So there's a bit more public intervention. Now this comes back to a fundamental point, right? This isn't just a gift to the poor, right?
No.
We need to change the equation of housing.
Yeah.
We need to have more providers in the market to add to the business models, because the problem with the housing market, I want to end on this point on housing, there's a natural limit, which is not a moral problem. It's not the moral limit set by developers. They have a business that they have to calibrate supply to. And if there's not enough demand in the market, they're not going to overproduce and collapse the prices. And that's not a moral problem. That is just a fact of life. So we have to find other models to help, to support and to add to the production of the private sector model. The government has to play a more muscular role, and some of it will be regulatory, some of it will be partnering, and some of it will be on its own land, and some of it will be through grants, right? And if you will the end, you have to will the means.
So what you've just described is the framework that's being applied in energy policy at the moment,
Interesting point, that
to bring forth a next generation
of
how we drive our economy
and
with
to
clean
de-risk
fuel.
innovation, right?
So there is and to de-risk innovation, right? Because we don't have the solution right now to fossil fuels. We are working our way there. We've made a couple of bets around things like hydrogen, which a number of particularly Western democracies and Japan have really made a bet on. So there's absolutely no reason why you can't apply that framework
analogy a lot,
to housing. And I think we're getting there.
Yeah, it's incredibly slow to break through to the idea that this is a business model issue. Right,
I think that's a good way of describing it.
Yeah, so I think some of the things I say are true, by the way. And and that was, I follow that up by saying some of the things I say about myself are true, right? Which is, but with the implication that not all of them are. But I do think that we've misunderstood. Here's a big sort of ending of the discussion, if you want to end. But we've misunderstood housing. I'm not convinced, and you and I both work in government. I'm not entirely convinced that even people who have had housing minister on their label and bureaucrats have not understood how the private sector works and has to work to turn a return and to deliver what it's doing. And so, although it fixates on some part of helping the private sector, and I understand it, like simplifying planning and all that kind of stuff, to be honest, I think there are no roads to solving our housing problem in Australia without the government playing a more creative and interventionist role with the private sector that knows how to partner. That is my view.
And that is a good point. And again, it's transitioning housing authorities in government agencies into organisations that don't deal just with public sector social housing
Absolutely.
stock,
Yeah.
which has traditionally been the role of these things,
Yeah.
towards one
Yeah.
that actually starts to private with the partnership with the private sector, and that has been started. It's been a bit slow, but it's started, and we're seeing things like this now happen. There's a number of bids
Yeah.
in play in Victoria
It's
and
in
New
play.
South Wales.
It's in
that
play,
are
and I think
doing it.
and I think the private sector is coming to the party in a way of saying we do need some new models.
Yeah.
We can't deliver. I think the other thing is there's a great phrase. You know, the economist of the moment, Mariana Mazzucato, you know, was Jim Chalmers quoted. By the way, he never got enough credit for doing what a politician, and you and I know this, never does, which is name his sources in a speech. Right? It's just, you know, amazing. You know, Biden wrote a whole speech without saying it was written by Neil Kinnock. You know, so I do think that's really important. She wrote a book. Her first book was called The Entrepreneurial State.
Okay.
Right?
What was the author's name?
Mariana Mazzucato is the one that Jim Chalmers was quoting in his new approach to capitalism speech.
Oh, right, in the essay, the famous essay.
She's an Amazonian economist from London who I've met, and the only person successfully to walk all over me. I promise you, quite hard. She's very impressive. So she has written a book called The Entrepreneurial State. That's what we need.
Interesting. Well, there you go, viewers. You can have a read of that and see what it says. Look, I want to go back a bit because we started on office and we started on city.
Yeah.
And I want to go back there quickly. So what's the future of the office, right? So we're in the office now. I thoroughly agree with you that cities are about agglomeration, about economic productivity, about idea generation.
Yeah, that doesn't come from Zoom,
It
right?
doesn't come from Zoom. Zoom is a wonderful tool.
Of course.
I think, you know, we
Are you an
now
investor
see...
in Zoom, Jason? Is
No,
that why you
not at
said
all. Or
that?
Zoom or Teams or whatever, WebEx or anything else that we use. Video is a wonderful
Indeed.
tool.
The moving
FaceTime.
image. The moving image.
Yeah, the moving image, which, you know, I think is a great
and
tool.
it's here to stay. We know this, right? So
Particularly for international engagement, which I do a lot of.
Yeah.
It's important because you can't be on planes all the time. But I think, you know, 3 days a week, people are sort of in now. Sydney's coming back to life. I think Melbourne is. Hong Kong certainly was.
okay.
But we're not back to where we were.
No,
What's the future?
No,
right?
I think that the most abused phrase in political and you know, sort of intellectual advisory work is it's different this time, right? But I do actually think it might actually be different this time, right?
Yeah.
Which is to say, we've seen this, or rather, this is what cities go through. Of course, they go through periods of decline and fall. They reinvent themselves and all this kind of stuff. But it can sometimes take decades. We forget that inner Melbourne had a 20 to 25-year transition from one cycle downwards in the 80s, when the city centre was pretty denuded at weekends and there was nobody living there, and all the industrial jobs were going and all that kind of stuff, to then becoming a knowledge economy centre from the back end of the 90s and all that. So basically there can be a long period of hiatus, right? So I think that's to be understood. So the optimists, they change, they recover, they renew, completely agree, but it can take a long time, right? Second thing is this. There are signs that certain things have got fixed. So 2 years ago, I always loved the idea that I might have been prescient, so allow me to do this. When it started happening, I said to my new employers, Grimshaw, world's great architects, I said, I think we might see the 70% city in 2 years' time. And they said, what's that then, Tim? And I said, well, 70% back on the public transport, 70% back in the office. But although that sounds like pretty good,
so it's 64, I
exactly,
think, on
it's
the
not a
transport
return.
network.
This is not going back to 100%, right? So that is a fundamental fact of our lives. Consequences first, and then what we might do about it. Consequences people are just not thinking about are, you know this, public transport was underwater when it was 100%.
Yep.
You know, so the idea that it's 70% and not 100% of what it was is a long-term problem.
22 cents in the dollar.
Yeah, exactly. We would exactly right. So basically, the return we got was 22% on the dollar before COVID, right? So this means that we either will see a long-term problem for justifying public transport projects with Treasury saying, "You're kidding," or we will see different reasons as to why we need mass transit, which is, for example, could be the denser, more energy-efficient city. It could be health and well-being.
So that's Parramatta, Western Sydney.
Exactly right. So what I'm saying is, I think it's still the game has changed, but we need the appraisal process. You know, I'm obsessed with these. The government uses to justify projects is changing. Will have to change, and I think health and well-being and social and environmental impact will become pretty dominant in how we decide.
So the benefit-cost ratio has a fast
will change.
social.
Will change. The social
cost
side of that will become much more important, I believe. Right. So I think that's going to happen, but we're not there yet. So public transport's in trouble. The office is being reinvented as we know, right? So, by the way, last point on transport is just amazing. So Manhattan, 60% return to the office, 3 years in, 60% return to the office at any one point, 110% return on the road. So people have not been commenting on this, but we've had more...
60% return on traffic,
on
transport,
no, 60% return in the office, 60% return to the office,
yes.
110% return on the
road.
roads.
Meaning they're using cars to get to work.
Okay. Right? And the reason is partly, it started out as health and security, but you didn't want to share a bus with people. And that got stuck in some people, so unfortunately we've seen vehicle miles travels rise. Car ownership has been rising for the first time. But it's also that if you're only going in 2 or 3 times a week, you don't buy a season ticket.
So it's cheaper to run your car
in, right? And we're also seeing amazing Google Earth evidence. I love this, because although I hate the consequence, I love paradox, right? Is that everybody's talking, we're cycling more, we're walking more. So the car outside my house, when I'm at home working, guess what I do? I use it more than I was using it before when it was outside my house and I was at my place of work. Right. So we're seeing lots of random journeys.
Because people are at home more, so they're going out to the shops.
They're bored, they're going out to the shops.
So what about a counterpoint though? People would say, okay, I'm in 3 days a week, I'm driving my car more, but now I'm dropping my kids at school, I'm dropping them at childcare, I'm picking them up.
Although I sometimes give the impression of being a fundamentalist on this, because and not because by the way, I completely disagree. I'm not an agent provocateur. I just happen to be somebody who has a pithy way of explaining it.
You didn't like my description of you, Mike.
Well, that's true, yeah. So, but I do think it's important to make people think about fundamentals, and I'm trying to do that. So look, I think that the COVID experience and that point reminded us of some of the downsides of the city model that we've been building, right? So some of these city models. But I still think, it's funny, International Women's Day yesterday, and I still can't get enough buyers for the proposition that if women are working at home more, they're going to be doing more of the homework. They're not going to be seen by their bosses in the office, and we're actually going to damage women's careers. I
completely agree with
it. It seems obvious to me, and I just can't understand it. And it feels like there's a kind of sort of boomer narcissism going on, where it's, by the way, I want to do this, when did anybody ever say it was healthy for you to sit in your backside for 10 hours a day at home, not meet anybody and not go out? When was that?
It suits certain people.
It suits certain people.
I look at myself and my teammates and colleagues. Those of us who work in customer-facing origination, deal, office, right? We need to be in the office.
No, I think this is where we get
to. And I find the home world almost energy debilitating. I just feel like I lose all my energy.
Don't talk about your family life in public like this.
Right, that's right. I didn't mean that. I meant if I was working at home. Sorry, Margaret. But I find the office energizing. My team's around me, colleagues around me.
But your distinction is a good one, so let's be real for the moment.
But there are some people that's the opposite, right?
Let me stop being a fundamentalist for the moment and just say the world has turned. And the world has turned for some good reasons. So that phrase that comes to mind is this: businesses, offices, cities have to earn the commute. That is true, right? Yeah. So they're earning the commute. Your point about some life coming back is fascinating, right? The type of life that's coming back to Sydney and Melbourne and London and other cities is different to what it was before. We're noticing that there's still only 50-60% back in the offices, but people are either having a party just before they go home on a Thursday rather than a Friday.
Thursdays become the new Friday,
right? Yeah. Or they're coming in to the city on different days because they're bored of being at home, so they want to. So that the idea of the city as a party city, as a cultural city, as an experience city, is going to become more dominant.
So I'm glad you raised that, because it's a good segue into arts and culture.
Yeah,
right?
It's exactly what's going to happen.
I've become more attuned to this, I think, than I have earlier in my career, about the importance of arts and culture and
it's going to be more important as well
to a city, right?
Yeah.
So if you think of the great cities in the world, the New Yorks, the Parises, the Londons, all have wonderful entertainment districts, right? Melbourne, I went for a run around the core of Melbourne from Sofitel, 4 theatres in one location, right?
Yeah,
and my great friend Michael Castle, who does such wonderful work here and bringing theatre to Sydney, one of his great passions, in fact, we don't have enough theatre space. We need more. And one of the ideas we've been working on is turning the White Bay Power Station into a theatre. Yeah, right. And the egalitarianism of the theatre to people is remarkable, right? How do we get that right in Australian cities? Right?
Well, I think this is a perverse opportunity of the COVID era, you know, where essentially, and again, I don't like the phrase, but I think there's something in the idea of the move from the central business district, because we didn't really have CBDs. They're always a bit more mixed than that, but let's just say to central experience districts.
The central experience.
I think there's something in this.
I've heard this phrase, central experience
I think
district.
the discussion is worth having, because I think whether or not you call it that, whether or not it's as extreme as that, we're going to see more mixed-use city centres, right? I think that's the lesson. Backtrack one. So offices are reinventing themselves. A great, interesting thing in the market is that there are, we didn't talk about this, but just quickly, stranded assets from people who are getting lower rents now because they're not what people want for that to earn the commute. You're right? Well. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. It's a big agenda. And also they don't qualify for like modern ESG reporting standards, right? So basically there's a big opportunity, right, actually, in retrofitting the office to be what it needs to be. So I think that's quite interesting. On the retrofitting cities to be what they need to be front, I think that is where we're going to go. The central experience stuff is, you know, the party city, right? Avoiding them being theme parks is going to be important. But I think that the mixed use future is the answer to that. So that we're already seeing internationally, not here so much, but requests to shift the use of an office to a residential or to a more mixed use future. We will see more of that, I think.
So we see it in Melbourne.
Okay, yeah.
We're not seeing it so much in Sydney yet because I think planning authorities are still uncomfortable with this concept around particularly older commercial buildings being converted into residential.
It's a big call, this, but I think it might come.
Well, I think it has to. I mean, it happens in London, right?
Yeah,
it happens in New York. You've got people living in the city. We have shied away from that because I think old style policy thinking around this was you had to protect employment zones from development, residential development, because it would crowd out jobs, right?
Oh, this is critical. Right?
It was critical. Yeah. Having said that, now it's changed now.
I think this last bit is a subset of this, which is worth saying one thing about, which is that old style split of uses, which in America they call Euclidean zoning, not because of the famous Greek geometry person, but because there was a place called Euclid, which separated its uses between residential. Right? That was when industrial uses were dirty and smelly. Now that we've got fourth industrial revolution, modern manufacturing stuff coming, I can see some of that going back into city centres. I can see some of the ex-offices becoming kind of the workshops of the modern world, right? Yeah. So I think we will see more mixed uses, not in the old style, but that we might see vertical mixed uses as well as residential, as well as.
But again, in Asia, this happens now.
Indeed, right?
In Asia, this is already the case.
But back to your cultural point, you know, the people will need. The cities have always played the role of cultural creativity and performance, right? Of cultural mixing and performance. I think we'll see more of that because, in a sense, it's about saving. We have to save the phenomenon of the city, and the reinvention of it looks to me to be in that direction.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I just want to go a little bit further on residential in the city, which is to say, if you look at Melbourne, one of the reasons why it's successful is because people live in it, and so people are there after hours. People are there,
it's critical,
and in our city, in Sydney at the moment, and other cities that have really worked on this employment protection zone thing, which I think was important at the time. I'm not knocking it; it was the right idea at the time. Our city still empties out, and people leave.
I was astonished when I first came to Sydney.
Yeah, it's quiet.
At 4:30 in the evening, I was wondering where all these people were going.
COVID has made it worse.
Yeah.
So I think there's a fundamental rethink now on what we need to recover from COVID and to redefine the way our CBD, Central Experience District, works.
You and I agree on that, but it's funny, you know, we're just going through an election where nobody is talking about the future of the city or any. There's no. I mean, I've been quite surprised that it's like the elephant not in the room is actually the economy and the city after COVID, and not just the city centre, but what's going to happen to our historic town centres out there, where there may be an opportunity to use them more, right? But we may need to find ways to attract mixed-use development to them.
I mean, we're talking Parramatta, for example. At the moment, the current scheme for the Metro West Station, which is outstanding that it's going there, but it's 200,000 square metres of commercial office.
Right. Okay.
And that's a lot of office for an area that, probably can't support that. What it should be is a mixed-use precinct.
Yeah, completely.
Right?
So I think that decision-making stuff is where we're caught at the moment, where we're not quite sure. We've got some great, I'm not just saying this, the people like in the city of Sydney are being very good people protecting the economic development core for the good of the city. But we probably are in an era where we need to think through now what the mixed use sort of, how we do that without losing some of our economic driver kind of effect. The other thing I was going to talk about is some of the opportunities coming from changing logistics within cities. This is going to sound really, again, like, is that really interesting, Tim? Yeah, well, I think it is. You know, the Amazonization of our city, where you've got, you know, the big fulfillment centers on the edge, and then it sort of percolates through the system, right? We are seeing, I mean, during COVID, Amazon increased its footprint by, it trebled it. It trebled its global footprint in 2 years, right?
Extraordinary.
It bought everywhere, right? And it's selling some of them back out of the market at the moment, but essentially because it saw, and it's been buying, and here's where I wanted to go, it's been buying dying shopping centres and turning them either into warehouse and distribution, or they're going to become mixed-use town centres. And I think a huge opportunity in the market going forward in Australia is the reinvention of the shopping mall.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think we're just not quite getting a head around how exciting that could be. And it actually could lead to a kind of retrofitting of density within some suburban areas because they will become like town centres. So I actually am quite optimistic that is a very interesting market going forward.
That's great. Look, we'll have to end soon, and we could keep going
Really?
for a long, long period
Are
of
you
time.
sure?
But we'll have to end soon. So I'm going to ask you this, which is if you could do 3 things that we need to do for Australian cities with great brevity, what would those 3
You
things
shouldn't have
be?
said that, because everybody will have that Welsh problem again, right? So I think there's one is obvious, which is I fear, and you were probably there at the time actually. I fear that the Greater Sydney Commission revolution stopped halfway, right? So it does some great things and blah blah blah. But what it was in my head, and without being megalomaniac, I helped design it effectively, right? Is that I thought it was like on the way towards metropolitan self-governance. I think that for me, the big next step in Australia is a governance story around, you can't manage the cities operate at a metropolitan level. You need to find some way of doing that. London is a much better place than it was in 1999 when it didn't have a metropolitan government. So number one still is metropolitan governance, it seems to me. I think the second thing is the moment we're in requires acute public-private partnering. So I would get my skates on and really, if the new government coming in New South Wales almost needs to kind of day one start bringing people in and saying, what do you think about, you know, the economic future and how we make sure that we use our stranded assets and all that kind of stuff. I think there's a need, for my language, of greater public sector curation of transformation, right? Curation of transformation. I think the third thing is jobs, which is that we mustn't assume that the economy we've inherited goes forward in exactly the same way. There's a high moment of thinking about where the next jobs are going to come from, and again the role of public-private collaboration and universities in really generating a kind of innovation-based economy. And the fourth thing I think is making sure that we understand that this isn't just about the future of our inner cities, it's the future of our regional cities as well. So for me, it's a high governance and collaboration moment. And conversations like this are quite important to it.
Well, Tim, it's been absolutely wonderful having you on the show. Thank you so much for being part of Smarter Cities.
Thank you very much.